Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? We'll trace the golden threads they've woven through Oklahoma history. The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. While John J. Dwyer is completing the Oklahomans Volume 2, he is sharing his microphone with Red River Institute board member and award-winning author, broadcaster, and avocational historian Wade Burleson. I'm Gwen Falconer-Lippert. We'll dig for the golden nuggets of Oklahoma history here now on Oklahoma Gold, the Burleson Chapters. Dignifying their names by the stories we remember. Wade Burleson? Success on the gridiron and a Pulitzer Prize? What is this story?
Well, if you're a fan of Oklahoma University football, you of course know about Bud Wilkinson, Barry Switzer, Bob Stoops, and Lincoln Riley. All of them have been so successful during their coaching careers. But very few people know about a coach that is just as successful as the four that I've mentioned. He was the first coach of the University of Oklahoma football team. His name was Vernon Parrington. And if you ever go to Norman, the Parrington Oval, you'll hear of that, they'll call it out, you'll see a sign, and so on. It's the oval, the piece of land, where the first building of the University of Oklahoma was located. Well, Vernon Parrington was the first football coach of Oklahoma. He coached from 1897 to 1900. Now, they played a game in 1896, but they didn't have a coach. And so, I go every year to watch OU football. We have season tickets. And, I can tell you about modern football history. I think I've said before to you, Gwen, that my grandfather played football for the University of Oklahoma in 1929. So I know a lot about Oklahoma football. And I also know that a lot of people who love Oklahoma football know nothing about Vernon Parrington. In fact, I think you said to me, even you have taught history before.
And unfortunately, they just call it the North Oval.
Oh, good point. Yeah. So they've even begun to change the name. Nobody knows who Parrington is. Well, let me tell you about a game. It was the first away game for the University of Oklahoma, and Vernon Parrington was a young man, a graduate of Harvard University, so he's very scholarly, intellectual. He was in his 20s. He had come to start the English program at the University of Oklahoma, but he had also volunteered to coach the football team. And think back now. When did football start? College football. Well, it started 1869. So the year I'm talking to you about is 1897. Parrington coached OU football 1897, 1898, 1899, and 1900. 30 years after the first football game was ever played between Rutgers and New Jersey. Okay, and when we talk about football today, you have this image in your mind of, throwing the ball and quick and fast. Football in Parrington's day was like rugby. In fact, let me tell you about this first away game that he coached. It was against Kingfisher College. Yeah, exactly. Kingfisher College. The field at the fairgrounds, it was played at the fairgrounds in Guthrie, which at the time was the capital of Oklahoma Territory. We weren't even a state. And it was New Year's Eve, 1897. Yep. The ground was frozen, but there was no snow on it. And it was between the University of Oklahoma and, as I said, Kingfisher College. And it was like rugby. I mean, you would push the runner as much as you would tackle the runner, and so on. And one of the newspaper articles that I read said that one of the OU players objected to the pain that he felt every time he was hit by a Kingfisher player. Well, it was discovered by the referee that the Kingfisher player had hidden an elbow of a stovepipe underneath his jersey. So every time he hit the OU player, he would be hitting him with metal of a stovepipe. Right. But this field, I mean, nobody knew what football was. In fact, at halftime, Oklahoma was ahead only 8-6. And in fact, I apologize. Oklahoma ended up winning the game. Kingfisher was ahead at halftime, 8-6. But what happened in the second half was really, really funny. The Logan County Sheriff saw what was happening, and he thought a fight had broken out. So he comes out and tries to break up the fight, and it took Oklahoma President David Ross Boyd to convince the Logan County Sheriff that there was actually a game that was being played. So finally, after being convinced by the president of OU that a new game called football was being played on the fairgrounds, Logan County Sheriff, okay, all right, and he fired off his gun above his head to restart the contest, prompting the few spectators around to let out with appropriate rodeo hoops like, hold that steer, ride 'em, cowboy, yippee-yi-yi, and so on.
At the first football game?
At the first football game of OU. So if you can imagine that. Now, OU ended up coming from behind and winning 17-8, but that's the coach. He ended up having the highest winning percentage of any coach until Bud Wilkinson. His 4-year winning percentage was 79.8%. He had the exact same winning percentage in those 4 years that Bob Stoops had during his tenure. Only Bud Wilkinson, Barry Switzer, and Lincoln Riley had more wins in terms of percentage than Vernon Parrington. He, by all accounts, was a gentleman's gentleman. He was an intellectual. He had come to Oklahoma because he'd been offered the job. And, of course, you got to think, we're not a state yet. We're just a territory. You know, it's the University of Oklahoma. We are brand new. You have UCO, you have OU. But he starts the football program. He starts the English college and so on. But he ends up getting fired, Gwen, because people in Norman felt he was too liberal, too progressive. He was fired. He ends up going to the University of Washington in the Pacific Northwest. And it was there, while he was in Washington, he becomes a writer and eventually wins the Pulitzer Prize. And when we come back, I'll tell you the story about the OU football coach who wins the Pulitzer.
So how does someone become a magical coach when they're just an intellectual?
Well, you know, that's a great question in terms of, you know, I mean, what does it take? I look at Lincoln Riley and Barry Switzer. In fact, I know Barry Switzer. He's a friend. These guys are smart. Mm-hmm. I really think the best football coaches could make a career in anything that they do, whether it's business, whether it's writing, whether it's history, and so on. So I think Vernon Parrington, because he was fired, ended up having a second career. But I think most of the great football coaches, Bud Wilkinson, Senate run, for example, all of these great football coaches could have been like Parrington, but he ends up being the only one who wins a Pulitzer. And as I said, when we come back, I'll tell you more about it.
And the North Oval is really the Parrington Oval. This is Oklahoma Gold. Success on the gridiron and a Pulitzer Prize? Wade Burleson, please tell me this story.
Yeah, Vernon Parrington, first OU football coach, came to teach English Lit, to begin the English department. And as I said in the first segment, he was fired. And, you know, who fired him? Well, you know, Norman, Oklahoma was filled with a lot of Baptists who believed in prohibition, that you shouldn't drink. And they considered Parrington a liberal in morals. He drank, a progressive intellectually, and so on. And so come 1908, he had quit coaching the football team in 1900 to concentrate on English Lit. But in 1908, his contract was not renewed. But the good news was that the University of Washington. The president there, Thomas Paine, made a special trip to Emporia, Kansas, which was the hometown of Vernon Parrington. He grew up in Kansas, educated at Harvard. After he was fired from OU, University of Washington president came to Emporia and offered him a contract. And Parrington would later say it was the best thing that ever happened to him. He moved to Seattle, and it was there that his writing began to blossom. In fact, he began to write about the history of English literature. And to be candid, what he wrote was more about the history of America. When you read what Parrington writes, it's called Main Currents in American Thought. It's 2 volumes in length. He was working on a 3rd volume when he ended up dying prematurely, and suddenly he had not been ill. He died at the age of 58. But Volume 1 and Volume 2 wins the Pulitzer Prize for literature. And basically what Vernon Parrington does is he traces the democracy of the United States of America from Jefferson, the philosophy of Jefferson, to the philosophy of John Taylor. He traces the progress and growth of America, and he is truly a progressive, Gwen. What I mean by that is this. He kind of discounted the fundamental doctrines of our founding fathers, and he believed that there should be growth in one's view of the Constitution, growth in one's view of what is right, rather than interpreting the Constitution the way the Founding Fathers would have interpreted it or the way those who wrote the Constitution meant it. Vernon Parrington said you should interpret what is right based upon one's actions, not some abstract thought. So he was way too progressive for Oklahoma. But what's interesting is you look at Parrington today, he is canceled out. He is discounted. Yeah, he's Caucasian, he's white, he brings a perspective that is Caucasian and white. And Gwen, this has always been a lesson to me. I mean, I'm a historian, I'm also a pastor, and if you get nothing else out of this podcast of the first OU football coach who ends up winning the Pulitzer Prize for literature, get this. The term liberal and progressive and the term fundamental and conservative, they're all relative, because in 1908, Vernon Parrington was fired for being a progressive, but today he would be considered a fundamental and a conservative. So those terms are relative. They change over time. So I would just ask people to really be patient with others today. Don't make an assumption. Don't write somebody off because they view life differently than you, or they write things in a different way than you would write them, or say things differently than you would say them. Because I look at Vernon Parrington, fired from the University of Oklahoma for being a liberal, and now discounted and canceled today for being a conservative. Things change over time. This is a great man who has a great legacy in terms of what he did for Oklahoma.
And so your golden nugget would be to take things into perspective?
Yeah, I think, Gwen, that's a great question. My golden nugget for Vernon Parrington is simply this. I ended up pursuing a master's in history from the University of New Hampshire. And I did my thesis on Vernon Louis Parrington. Louis is a French name. Louis is the anglicized English way to say it. And one of the things that I discovered myself, and this is the golden nugget, is just be patient, open, and accepting of people who see things differently than you. And don't close your heart toward intellectuals that may be different, because you may turn away a guy like Vernon Parrington.
Success on the gridiron and a Pulitzer Prize, and that's Oklahoma Gold.